You're not feminists, are you?
Yeah.
It's a bit gross, yeah.
Aren't you?
I mean, I'm all up for equality, but no, I would not call myself a feminist.
But you do believe in equality?
Oh, of course.
And that women deserve the same amount of opportunities as men?
Absolutely.
Then you're a feminist.
No, I am not.
Or by definition.
Nope.
What's wrong with being a feminist?
Oh, bear with me on this one, but have I got a cracking example for you? So I make it a rule to try my very level best not to get personally and emotionally triggered by the patronising, supercilious and extremely exclusive manner in which fourth wave feminism tends to approach the matter of gender equality in the 21st century. But I stumbled across an article on The Guardian this week that did exactly that. And I've decided it's worth taking the time and effort to document it, if only so that future generations may one day look back in wonder at just how blindly chauvinistic some of the gatekeepers of equality matters were in the year 2018. Indeed, it involves an example of institutional sexism, supported not only by the state and all our mainstream political parties, but also the very vast majority of the Fourth Estate, experts in discrimination law, and a certain television soap star and self-identifying champion of gender equality. So I've included a link below for the expert opinion piece written by Anna Macy, who is a London barrister practicing in employment and discrimination law, which sets out her frustrations with guidance recently issued by the Government Equalities Office concerning workplace dress codes. For the uninitiated, the development of the guidance was directly informed by an incident in 2015 when a temping receptionist called Nicola Thorpe was sent home from her assignments at a London accountancy office without pay after refusing to wear high heels. So Nicola went home and duly started a petition to make it unlawful for employers to insist on high heels in the workplace. This quickly went viral and in a relatively short space of time achieved sufficient signatures to require a parliamentary debate. This in turn led to the Women and Equalities Committee conducting an investigation into sexist dress codes generally, who in January 2017 produced a report which concluded that the Equality Act 2010 is not yet fully effective in protecting workers from discrimination, and that there was an urgent need for employer guidance, which at the very least should address the more controversial dress code requirements which have been brought to light through the inquiry, such as high heels, hosiery, hair, makeup, manicures, revealing workwear, skirt length and low-fronted or on-button tops. Now, I have two main issues with Anna Macy's perspective, which we'll get into in a minute, and trust me, the second one is worth hanging around for. But first, let's consider what she has to say about the Equalities Office guidance. Last week, 10 months after the committee requested it, the Government Equalities Office finally produced its own guidance on how workplace dress codes and uniforms should comply with sex equality legislation. The guidance is bland and vague, failing to make it absolutely clear to employers that requiring heels, makeup and skirts will virtually always be unlawful discrimination, and shows that the government is not prepared to take on employers and address the serious problem of sexist dress codes in the workplace. The guidance avoids any mention of unwritten dress codes. There is an exceptionally small section on religious discrimination, no mention of race discrimination at all, limited information concerning disability and dress codes, and the section on transgender rights notes individuals should be able to choose the gendered dress code they feel most comfortable with, ignoring the clear conclusion of the committee that rigidly gender stereotyped clothing made many LGBT employers uncomfortable. The government could and should have made it explicitly clear that a requirement or expectation that women wear heels, makeup and skirts to work will virtually always amount to unlawful discrimination, period. And it does not matter what standards are set for men in the workplace. Such a bold and unambiguous statement from the Government and Equalities Office would have attracted the notice of employers to be on guard about any sexist dress codes they have in place. But this guidance, which took so long to produce, does not fit the shoe, and we are all still stuck with sexist dress codes. Now, if you'll excuse the pun, you don't necessarily have to literally or metaphorically walk a mile in someone else's uncomfortable shoes before it's possible to have some empathy with their situation. And you presumably won't be surprised when I say that I, for one, was entirely supportive of Nicola Thorpe's stand against her employer's archaic attitude. But, in fairness to the Equalities Office, and as an experienced barrister in discrimination law like Anna Macy should very well know, it's not actually their place to tell employers up and down the country specifically how they can or can't run their business. Indeed, aside from our democratically elected parliament, which produces employment-related legislation like the Equality Act 2010, it very often comes down to very highly paid barristers like Anna to fight out the less obvious grey areas in courts when people have a difference of opinion regarding what should or shouldn't be considered sex discrimination under such legislation. And consequently, aside from calling for a change to the actual legislation, the guidance for both employers who set dress codes and for people who may have to abide by them does seem to very clearly address Nicola's concerns in a fairly unambiguous fashion. Here's a bit of the executive summary. Dress codes can be a legitimate part of an employer's terms and conditions of employment, but it is best to avoid gender-specific prescriptive requirements. For example, the requirement to wear high heels, any requirement to wear makeup, skirts, have manicured nails, certain hairstyles, or specific types of hosiery are likely to be unlawful. As far as I can tell, Anna appears to be frustrated that technically and legally speaking, it is no more illegal for an accountancy firm to tell a lowly temp to wear heels today than it was before this guidance was published. But in fairness to the lady who campaigned to get the issue into the headlines, the reality of the situation is that it is in fact a lot less likely that any sensible employer would dare after all the publicity around her plight. And aside from the potential negative publicity and the inevitable ire of the extremely influential networked feminist mob, arguably the biggest reason they wouldn't dare is because, as the Equalities Office guidance helps to highlight, it was never particularly legal in the first place. Consider the expert legal opinion offered to the committee at the very start of their investigation.
Can I just kick off by asking you whether you think a requirement to wear high heels or any other gender-specific dress code, skirts, makeup for women or so on, is that as it stands unlawful in your view? Who wants to kick off?
Okay. I mean, it does depend whether it's part of a more general code. If it's a code for a particular conventional dress code, which applies to both men and women, then it would not probably be direct discrimination, but it would almost certainly be indirect discrimination because it bears more heavily on one sex than another. The employer can then justify that. Direct discrimination can't be justified, but indirect discrimination can, on the basis that it's reasonably necessary to achieve a legitimate aim. I must say, speaking for myself, I can't see many circumstances where wearing high heels would either be fulfilling a legitimate aim or would be reasonably necessary. I mean,
there seem to be a lot of people of both sexes who don't regard smart dress to involve high heels. So I think it's not necessarily clear that it isn't direct discrimination. I've tried hard to think about instances where it would be justified, or where you would say it isn't direct discrimination because of the job role. And at the moment, the only ones that have come to my mind are being a tango dancer. I mean, there's certain dances where stepping backwards you need a bit of a heel, and or maybe if you're a fashion model, a shoe model, you wouldn't be able to say that was directly discriminatory because you just couldn't do the job if you weren't prepared to wear high heels.
And if that all got a bit legalistic, here's none other than every woman Jess Phillips to get to the nub of the question.
As a woman now, if I don't want to wear high heels and I don't want to wear makeup, do I have any case in law that's...
Well, I would say it was indirect discrimination.
I think so, yes.
Long story short, with the obvious nuance of jobs like fashion models or, say, an actor playing the role of Imelda Marcus, you'd struggle to argue a legitimate aim for high heel requirements in most jobs. Which makes you wonder whether poor Nicola might have been saved her humiliating experience entirely if the previous government's Equalities Minister hadn't been oh so dismissive towards an earlier request for clarity about gendered dress codes. But before we get into that, here's another clip from the investigation which helps to highlight the potential Pandora's box the Equalities Office could have been accused of opening if they had, as Macy is demanding, gone further than they did.
And thinking of it from the point of view of health and safety as opposed to discrimination law, should employers be considering requirements of wearing things like high heels as part of statutory risk assessments? Because as the chair pointed out, older women being forced to wear high heels, it almost eliminates the ability of those women to have those jobs.
Yeah, I mean, it would be good practice. It certainly would be. And if there's now evidence, I understand the College of Podiatrists has sent in evidence. I mean, I have. That would be helpful to employers if there's an undisputed view on it, to have that acknowledged as something. I think a lot of women know that from their own experience, but I think a lot of men haven't applied their minds to it.
Maybe we should make them go out for an evening.
Yes, it's a bit harsh to point the finger so exclusively at men on this one, but no matter. And presumably one of the obvious reasons why men don't go about in high heels of an evening is because it's blindingly obvious how uncomfortable they are, and potentially dangerous in the long term. I mean, just look what happened to Prince. But Jess does make the very valid point that in the particular case of unnecessarily high-heeled shoes, arguably the issue is less about women's rights and more to do with not increasing the risk of injury by conditions of work, which is already set in law by the Health and Safety at Work Act. And the College of Podiatry did indeed provide the committee with a report establishing the existence of a strong body of clinical evidence that significantly indicates the medical and disabling effects of wearing a high-heeled shoe over any prolonged amount of time. The report outlines evidence of foot pain, bunions, painful skin lesions, lower limb pathology, falls, and subsequent injury, all associated with wearing high heels. And the college also reported that they had found that a staggering 90% of women had self-reported foot problems in 2013, and they therefore strongly urged for a change in the law regarding mandatory footwear policies for women that could harm both them and others around them. So I suppose you could say that the amount of empirical evidence linking high heels to injury, accidents and even deaths presents a fairly strong argument for legislation to tackle employers who allow footwear that could harm female employees and others around them. Indeed, why stop there? Given the estimated cost to the NHS of treating high-heeled related injuries, why not ban their sale entirely? After all, we're living in an age when it's almost impossible to so much as tweet an opinion without the state potentially intervening. Obviously, one reason against this is that grown adults should be allowed to make their own personal decisions about such matters. But a perhaps more compelling argument against such a draconian step is the fact, well known to most teachers who have ever tried to enforce a minimum skirt length, that possibly the one thing that feminists hate more than being told what they must wear, it's being told what they must not wear. especially when it comes to things like plunging necklines or showing a bit of leg. Something that was made clear when campaigner Nicola Thorpe rushed to Theresa May's defence when the Trade Union Council called on her to ditch her heels in solidarity with Nicola's campaign and to let the media see that she can be the most powerful woman in the country without wearing designer shoes to meet men's expectations. In response to this, Nicola put out a statement saying that Theresa May is an individual. She doesn't have a responsibility as a woman to change the way she dresses. She does, however, have a responsibility as a politician to fight for equality. Confusing, isn't it? Anyway, let's have one last clip from the committee before we get to the matter that triggered me so.
Are there any specific cases of case law in this field, any precedent that have been set? I mean, if there's hundreds, don't feel you have to name them all.
There's the nurse's hat, and then there's being required to wear a shirt and tie, which is lawful if you're a man. And then there was requiring a man not to have a ponytail.
So they're mainly around men? Interesting.
Yeah.
Just bring in Ben Howlett on that. I think he wanted to follow up something. Ben.
Thank you. I hate wearing shirts and ties, by the way, but hey, here we are. It's a very interesting set of debates we've been having on the Women and Equalities Committee in relation to the Equality Act in 2010. I was interested by the recommendations you were just talking about there, John.
Okay, so we'll stop the only male MP on the committee in his stride, because the point he's about to make isn't directly relevant to this discussion, as opposed to the point he's just made that everybody else in the room simply ignored.
So they're mainly around men? Interesting.
Yeah. Just bring in Ben Howlett on that. I think he wanted to follow up something. Ben.
Thank you. I hate wearing shirts and ties, by the way, but hey, here we are.
Now that is a fair point. Ties may not be quite as uncomfortable as walking around in heels all day, but
ties are restrictive.
Yeah.
They're uncomfortable. They don't serve any practical purpose.
Yeah, you're right, okay. It's not fair to let women wear comfy shoes if we're going to expect men to wear a noose around their neck, is it?
which again is a fair point. And it does seem a tad arbitrary and unfair, not to mention an extremely clear-cut example of direct and indirect sex discrimination. And by the way, I don't want to be unduly harsh, but the barrister's considered opinion on the legality of being required to wear a tie if you're a man is not entirely accurate and actually somewhat misleading. Because the case law she's basing that opinion on involved the plight of a poor lowly worker in the Department of Work and Pensions, no less, who successfully won his complaint of sex discrimination in 2003 over his desire to breathe more easily. Indeed, none less than The Guardian celebrated his victory at the time, stating that his claim was in the great tradition of Manchester dissent, and you could almost hear the ghosts of the Chartists greeting his victory. Mr. Thompson specifically won his case because he was very easily able to show that he was being treated less favourably than his female colleagues. And indeed, this outcome even features as an example case study in the relevant section of the 300-page Statutory Employment Equality Code of Practice, available long before the recent parliamentary investigation, which is designed to help employers stay on the right side of the law. But before you start loosening your knots, I'm afraid to say that the same section of the Code of Practice also explains why the matter is still slightly fudged. It states that it is not necessarily sex discrimination for a dress code to set out different requirements for men and women. For example, that men have to wear a collar and tie. However, it may be direct discrimination if a dress code requires a different overall standard of dress for men and for women. For example, requiring men to dress in a professional and businesslike way, but allowing women to wear more casual clothes. So, in other words, because it's an established tradition dating well past the introduction of the sex discrimination laws in the 70s, all the way back to some arbitrary whim of a 17th century French king, then employers back in 2003 could argue that if they wanted men and women to dress in a professional and businesslike way, then that could include instructing men only to wear a pointless bit of cloth around their neck. Obviously, 2003 was quite some time ago, and fashions can change quite dramatically in a relatively short space of time. But hold that thought for a minute, because it's time to consider the second issue with the expert legal opinion of the Guardian-sponsored discrimination law specialist. And if you haven't already guessed, this is where we dig down and expose the extraordinary example of institutional sexism that this issue reveals. Let's consider her words again. The government could and should have made it explicitly clear that a requirement or expectation that women wear heels, makeup and skirts to work will virtually always amount to unlawful sex discrimination, period. And it does not matter what standards are set for men in the workplace. Over and above the fact that the government have in fact bent over backwards to address Ms. Thorpe's concerns, it is the considered opinion of a high-profile barrister in discrimination law that as long as they get the rules exactly right for women, covering every possible scenario, then it does not matter a damn to her what rules are set for men. So much for the mantra that equality is better for everyone, I guess. Now, some may consider this to be quite a shocking statement to come from the pen of a discrimination lawyer, but in her defence, she may very well argue that context is everything. And in this particular context, equality, or more specifically equalities, really is not for everyone, because neither the predominantly female cross-party Equalities Committee or the government's Equalities Office have any remit or apparently moral interest in any arbitrary rules imposed on men in the workplace, which is why their investigation into sexist dress codes completely ignored the experiences of over 53% of the UK workforce, as did the fairly robust set of recommendations arising from them, which led to the dress code guidance that has so vexed our esteemed barrister in discrimination law. And despite the fact that various people raised the issue of dress codes impacting on men during the inquiry, including an actual member of the actual investigation committee, the only mention of rules for men is tucked away in their FAQ section, which interestingly employs this sort of unequivocal language that our esteemed barrister in discrimination law was crying out for in her article, this time to state that a requirement for men to wear a tie is not unlawful. But here's the thing, strictly speaking, the guidance issued on contemporary dress codes for men by the Equalities Office with no actual remit for protecting the equal rights of men isn't strictly correct. Because if you've managed to pay attention this far, you'll hopefully know that it's the courts, not the Equalities Office, who get to decide such matters. And so presumably they're basing their advice on the case law helpfully established by Mr. Thompson and the court's interpretation of proper business attire, quite literally at the turn of the century. But times move on, and the government has quite recently spent a not inconsiderable amount of taxpayers' money pondering on the rights and wrongs of modern day workplace requirements. And two of the very first things they considered is that there are both medical and social implications arising from strict dress codes, especially when considering examples of uncomfortable dress. And if a different standard is imposed onto a worker based solely on an accident of birth, then this will probably be direct sex discrimination. Indeed, if a specific item of clothing imposed on someone can't meet a reasonableness test, then at the very least, the employer will be guilty of indirect sex discrimination. Take the Houses of Parliament, for example, whose own dress code was fairly recently found to do both. Indeed, in the very same year as numerous MPs were getting so vexed about arbitrary and discriminatory dress codes being imposed on us lowly taxpayers, an expert in gender and politics was asked to audit Parliament's current practices and make recommendations on how the House of Commons can better meet the Inter-Parliamentary Union's globally influential gender-sensitive parliaments framework. And the membership of the Women and Equalities Committee will undoubtedly be well aware of the report, because not only did their chair help to launch it, but the committee as a whole jumped at the recommendation about currently illegal female quotas for parliamentary elections, and even sanctions for any party which fails to comply. So one assumes that at least one of them will have read as far as page 23, and the recommendation to revise Parliament's own currently rather archaic dress code. The report notes that the dress codes in the chamber, as in wider society, are explicitly gendered, and that male MPs have a right to be aggrieved that such a strict dress code, including a jacket and tie, is imposed onto them, whilst no similar standard is set for women, who can get away with anything from knee-length boots to denim and t-shirts. Fortunately, Professor Child's solution is relatively straightforward. Specifically, reframe the convention in a gender-neutral way, one that removes the men's stricter dress code, given that today's business dress does not always require of men a jacket and tie. Which all in all begins to paint a very simple picture of why it is that people are increasingly beginning to call for a Minister for Male Equalities to plug a fairly obvious and frankly illegal hole at the heart of government. But if you can bear to watch any further, I want to peel another couple of layers of this particular onion to help the lady at the top of the show understand at least one tiny aspect of what exactly is wrong with modern feminism. Because the lady at the top of the show just happens to also be the lady with the smart flat shoes, who embarrassed the government into dragging employers into the 21st century, at least when it comes to the rules they can impose 47% of the workforce. Two interesting facts about Nicola. Firstly, she's a feminist. And secondly, she appears to be a pretty well-connected feminist and model and television actress, currently starring in the nation's favourite soap show, Coronation Street. Two facts which presumably were a great help when she managed to get enough exposure for her petition to not only generate the number of signatures required to force a debate in Parliament, and prompt a grovelling apology from both the offending employer and their parent company, but also garner enough public support from a cross-section of MPs and even the First Minister of Scotland that she even managed to secure a parliamentary investigation on the wider issue of discriminatory dress codes in the workplace. Pretty impressive stuff. Now, if you're wondering what sort of reception a basic bloke might receive if he were to raise the not entirely dissimilar issue of being forced to wear a noose to work, then you'll be interested to know that we do actually have a comparison case to consider. Or to use the terminology favoured by barristers specialising in discrimination law, consider this direct comparator. Because as numerous people have taken great pleasure in reminding her, 5 years before the massive brouhaha over the girl with the flat-heeled shoes, none less than the now most important person in the country, self-identifying feminist and then acting Minister for Women and Equalities, Theresa May, was asked a formal question in the House on behalf of a lowly constituent, or pleb as I believe we're sometimes referred to. Her extraordinarily flippant response was essentially that the constituent in question could get fucked. And by the way, look at the fancy designer kitten heels I'm wearing. Today I'm wearing a silver grey trouser suit and a pair of shoes from LK Bennett. As Secretary of State for the Home Department, I have not found that traditional gender-based dress codes have held me back. I indeed believe that they encourage a sense of professionalism in the workplace. A fact which Macy gleefully reminds us of in her critique of the new guidance, and something that the Financial Times described thusly. It is not just the casual dismissal that grates. The fact that Mrs. May herself, a highly educated, highly paid woman, who one feels must never have lacked the confidence to fight her own battles, believes that because she is not personally being discriminated against, it is irrelevant. It reflects the willingness of too many contributors to this debate to personalise it and fail to recognise the broader issue of sexism in the workplace. Now, in the context of Nicola Ofcori's recent plight, Theresa has unsurprisingly changed her tone on such matters, but I'm sure it won't surprise you to learn that although the question did request an up-to-date assessment of the legality of gender-specific workplace dress codes in general, the specifics of the question related to the requirement to wear a necktie and evolving business fashion trends beyond the gates of a parliament that was subsequently found to have rather sexist and archaic rules about dress. Still, At least we now have a well-placed and established champion and campaigner against sexist dress codes. So presumably Nicola will be highlighting the hypocrisy of cutting the majority of the workforce, not to mention the basic blokes who contribute the lion's share of taxation that pays for all of this. Won't she? Well, no. And rather obviously no, because as I recently pointed out, Nicola is a feminist, and seemingly something of a cliched one at that, because although she was quick enough to defend the most important person in the country's right to wear the type of footwear that experts to the investigation convened on her behalf have described as a potential danger to both herself and others, she has been notably silent on gender dress codes, impacting on people who don't especially look like her. At least so I thought, until I stumbled upon her campaigning website called Who Are You Wearing?, which is ironically named after the apparently age-old sexist red carpet question, and apparently aims to challenge gender stereotypes and discuss gender equality and discrimination issues. It includes a few comedy skits written by Nicola, which are presumably intended to generate some thought and discussion about matters of equality. Predictably enough, they're not very funny, and to be honest, their message is so muddled, not to mention cliched, that it seems pointless bothering to critique them. But then I watched the third video, which speaks to Nicola's specialist subject, and frankly, if she ever wants a succinct and serious answer to the question she posed at the start of the show, then I politely suggest that she kicks off her shoes and considers her own creation. It involves someone a lot like Nicola being told that her campaign to wear comfy shoes in the workplace has been entirely successful, only for one of those annoying men types to step up and put a spanner in the works.
Look, I'm all for equality in the workplace. But I don't see why women should be allowed to wear comfortable, flat shoes when men are still forced to wear ties.
But it's not really the same. Well, he does have a point. Does he?
I do. Ties are restrictive.
Yeah.
They're uncomfortable.
Were ties designed to make you look sexier?
Arguably. And they don't serve any practical purpose.
Yeah, duh! Look, you're right, okay, it's not fair to let women wear comfy shoes if we're going to expect men to wear a noose around their neck, is it?
Look, if this is about equality, surely men and women should be treated exactly the same.
No, that's not the point.
Okay, Alison, look, this is not a feminist thing. If we're aiming for equality in the workplace, which we are, then the only thing we can do is treat everybody exactly the same.
Nice one, Kieran.
What's wrong with feminists, she asks. Give me fucking strength.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.